Good to go, Eva.
Yep, go ahead.
Cool. Well, good morning. Good Wednesday morning, and welcome to iSelect's Deep Dive webinar series. For any of you who are unfamiliar with me, my name is David. I'm an associate here on the iSelect Fund Ventures team, and I'm excited to walk you through today's presentation and findings. For those who are new to these webinars, iSelect is an early stage venture capital firm in St. Louis, Missouri, focused primarily on early stage companies in healthcare and agriculture. At iSelect, we're privileged to sit at the forefront of innovation, seeing emerging problems, solutions, and macro trends at their beginning before they make their way into popular culture. And we use these deep dive presentations not only as a way for us to better engage with and understand new science technology, but also to engage with the experts and entrepreneurs who are driving change and innovation in their respective fields. Now, not to beat a dead horse here, but we are going to be talking about the implications of COVID-19 today. As a healthcare, food, and agriculture focused fund, the effects of the pandemic are profound on both sides of our portfolio. 2 weeks ago, some of you may have joined us as we dove into some of the consequences of the pandemic in the way healthcare is and will be delivered. Today, we'll talk about how the pandemic has impacted our food system from the farm to the consumer. The more I research the topic, the more it has become clear to me that there's a lot of uncertainty in how the food system could change, and also some profound changes that have already occurred, and there's still a lot of time for the dust to settle. The key examinations we will walk through today fundamentally are how will the means of food production, the content of our diets, and the ways in which food gets to us change as a result of COVID-19. A few process comments. We are not soliciting investment or giving investment advice in any way whatsoever. This presentation is general industry research based on publicly available information. We invite you to this because you're technologists, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, industry experts, early adopter customers, or sophisticated investors that are part of the iSelect network. We value your thoughts, questions, comments, and insights into this topic, and would greatly appreciate it if you actively engage during the presentation. Thank you in advance for your attendance and active participation. We ask that you put yourself on mute for the time being. However, we do hope for this to be an engaging, interactive presentation. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question or to provide commentary. Finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay. And with that, I am pleased to bring you this week's deep dive on COVID-19 implications across the food system. So let me tell you what I'm going to tell you before I tell you it to you. Principally, what we're going to talk about today, and the way I've broken down the agenda for this presentation, is at a high level, a discussion around implications at the farm level, implications at the supply chain level, and implications at the consumer level around how our food system has changed as a result of COVID-19 in both short-term, long-term, and accelerated trends. We'll also then dive into some sort of key subtopics for discussion. Those will principally be around the pressures around animal agriculture and sort of this drive for plant-based, animal-free, and how the future of animal agriculture fits into that paradigm shift. We'll talk about supply chain resilience versus efficiency, and trying to think about ways in which we can improve supply chain resilience while potentially not sacrificing efficiency, and to what degree we can do so. And we will also talk about, there's one third trend, that is robotics, automation, and labor. And we'll talk about how some of those paradigm shifts have occurred over the last few weeks, and how some of those problems and challenges that already occurred at the farm level have been exacerbated. And finally, we'll close for some thesis thoughts and discussion. And again, this is meant to be an open platform for questions, comments, so please feel free to chime in as we jump through this. I want to give a sense of sort of who's going to be on the call today. We have a really interesting group of speakers as well as experts that we have joining us. And we really want to drive an interesting discussion based around some of the perspectives of the individuals on this call today. For the distinct speakers here, Alex Lorestani, Kevin Van Trump, and Gary Wisnowski, it'd be great if you guys could just give a brief 30-second overview of you, your background, your company, and then I'll also speak on some of the experts that we have on the call as well.
Thanks, David. I'd be happy to kick things off. This is Alex.
Alex, I don't know if you want to kick things off.
Yeah, sounds great. It's great to be with you all. My name is Alex Lorestani. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Geltor. We're a startup and iSelect portfolio company. What we do is design and manufacture proteins using fermentation for a variety of consumer product industries, including food and beverage. So really excited to be with you all today. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Kevin?
Yeah, hi, this is Kevin Van Trump. I was a trader in Chicago Board of Trade for a number of years.
Now, angel investor and well, just trader still, investor in the ag space. Mostly write a daily wire newsletter, try and gather my own thoughts and bearings about our own investments and where things are headed. So hope I can be of some insight.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. And Gary?
Yes. Hi, everybody. My company, Wish Farms, it's nearly 100 years old. I'm a third generation berry shipper. And now since the 1980s, we've also been growing berries, where we have operations on strawberries on both coasts, as well as blueberries from all over North and South America, and raspberries and blackberries, all doing that 52 weeks a year. I'm also the co-founder of Harvest Crew Robotics, a startup that's also a portfolio company of iSelect. And that company is working on robotics currently for strawberries, but in the future we'll be doing a lot of other crops. So that's my basic background.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. We're also joined by Vonnie Estes from the Produce Marketing Association, Connie Bowen from the Yield Lab Institute, Nia Gupta from Fork and Good, Kim Wagner from TBGD Partners, Mike Wise, STG Ventures, Russ Conzer from Blue Nest Beef and other ventures as well, Maurice Keene, Open Gate Partners, and I believe Yaniv from AgFront will be joining us as well, though we may have had some stragglers here, but a really great crowd nonetheless. So where I'd like to start things off is by providing some data on some things that were happening before COVID and some things that maybe have changed or happened during COVID, and then get some perspectives from some of the experts that we have on the call on either some insights that they've seen, some areas and where they see potentially long-term trends occurring as opposed to maybe some short-term pitfalls. So let's start with at the farm level, and then we'll go into the supply chain, and then we'll go to the consumer. So to sort of set the stage prior to COVID from sort of a challenges and trends standpoint, one thing that we've talked a lot about has been around sort of labor shortages, particularly on the specialty side, was a challenge that was existing prior to COVID. Additionally, we've done some coverage on farm profitability as another major area of which farmers have seen pressures on over the years, and as alongside increased farmland consolidation, which is somewhat a result of that and tied into that as well. Then we all start to think about precision agriculture adoption as an area that we're focused on a lot, and driving data into agricultural decisions going forward. And here on the right, you can see, at least in the top right quadrant, some of the key labor loss particularly for specialty crops across a variety of states in the U.S., and also some data showing the farm share of the food dollar, which means the amount of money that farmers are earning per every dollar spent on food has decreased over the last 20 years or so. And so some key questions around challenges that farmers are facing going forward. And then COVID hit a couple months ago in the U.S., or at least probably hit a couple months before that, but really the distinct awareness around it starts sort of February, March timeframe. And we initially, when we think about food and agriculture, these are staples in everybody's life. These are things that everybody needs. So we think about from a resiliency standpoint for an industry, you would expect it to be an industry that holds up pretty well. And in some ways it has. We've also seen some challenges surrounding COVID-19, either in new trends that have occurred, new weaknesses that have either been exposed, or problems that have been exacerbated. And one of those major problems that I mentioned before is around this labor shortage issue. Particularly in some of the research that I've done and data that I've consumed has been around, specialty growers in Spain and in the U.S. In the U.S., I think they're still allowing H-2A visas to come through for foreign labor, but in the same token, it's only exacerbated those challenges, particularly for labor that is for types of crops that are very labor intensive or that require people to work in close quarters. So that's been a problem that's sort of been exacerbated by this. Another that's been brought to my attention is around climate vulnerability. So thinking about farmers who may have been hit harder by COVID-19, particularly if they were selling into food service as opposed to retail and consumer, where the hits to their bottom line could be further exacerbated by some of these other risks and some of these climatic events that we might expect to see. or that are of greater intensity going forward in the future. Also, there's been some data shown around sort of disproportionate impact, really surrounding developing countries where they may not have the same degree of agricultural resilience that the U.S. and other countries may have, and their ability to produce food. And I think there's been a lot of focus around in the U.S., we'll talk about this more in the supply chain section, around the fact that we actually do have enough food to feed everybody in the country, but there's been a substantial increase in waste because of the way the supply chain is up. So that's another challenge. And then finally, major price drops for a wide variety of commodities. Some of this due to decreased demand and decreased spending, but also some of this due to the fact that, again, and we'll talk about this more at the supply chain level, that there's certain quantities of food that aren't being, they just can't be serviced or sold at the retail or at the consumer level. They're really only fit for the food service level, or there's been a lot of loss at that point. And we can see that in the right here on the impact on commodity futures prices, as well as record stocks for ethanol, where there's been a substantial decrease in use and demand. So with some of those data points in mind, Kevin, I'd be interested to get your perspective, on where you see some of the biggest impacts so far on the farmers that you work with and the farmers that you interface with the most recently, and particularly in the context of who's been hit the hardest, why, has anybody been more resilient than others, and why, and are there any groups that you see as more vulnerable going forward in the future, and any trends that you see developing out of this?
Yeah, I'm mainly partners in ground here across the U.S. and in South America, and we're mainly large row crop farming, and I sit on the board of some larger cattle operations. The cattle side has seen some labor issues with some people's visas getting pulled, but primarily, just as you were saying, I think it's more on the smaller specialty crop, more labor intensive side of thing. We have one of my partners is in Missouri, is one of the largest watermelon producers in the U.S., and they have the labor issues annually that they battle. So I think there has been, a little bit more in the press about it, but from our perspective, it's just the continuation of lower prices. And, as we've learned, we believe in the row crop space, especially, I think globally, you're in a race for higher yields and lower prices. And that is really what has bamboozled and has a lot of the producers offside, so to speak. Their business plan and business model is, they have a hard time grasping or understanding that that's really in the dynamics that we are in today's world. I mean, with technology coming on more and more and being exported globally, we're seeing stiffer and stiffer competition around the world on commoditized type of crops. And that's, everything number 2, yellow corn, traditional soybeans, wheat, cotton. And that's really, we're no longer the low cost producer. I don't know who's that, but anyway, yeah, like I said, we're no longer the low cost producer. And that's, I think, caught a lot of people, like I said, offsides, and how they pivot and transition is going to be critically important. We suspect you're going to see some of the higher cost producers. Like I said, the world looks to the United States now really to cut acres on some of those traditional crops. Now, unique dynamic, we're in an election year, and obviously we saw yesterday the USDA rolled out another big subsidy program, and they're going to continue to subsidize. And so we're not certain where you're going to get the acreage cuts. Maybe prices eventually fall low enough in corn and beans and wheat that you reduce some global acres, but it's really hard for us to get our hands around that moving forward. So like I said, we suspect that the divide is you're going to have bigger farms continue to, you're going to have more farms continue to get larger so they can use technology at scale, reduce their overall costs and expenses to try and battle and stay in the game as a low cost producer of traditional crops. The ones that can't do that, we suspect are going to pivot more towards specialty crops. and probably create more supply in the specialty area. And I think you'll see premiums start to dry up in those spaces eventually as well, as more people pivot to non-GMO and traditional and some of the specialty type plays. So, it's going to be tough. We suspect the space continues to consolidate. And, like we said, I think technology more than ever is going to play a tremendous role in helping the farmer. Those that are receptive to technology are going to be able to battle and compete, just like we've seen on the oil sector and the oil side of things with shale and reducing their cost. You're going to be able to compete and stay in the game. And those that are not as receptive to technology are going to struggle and probably be knocked out. And
do you think we'll see more? Do you think we'll see an acceleration of consolidation? One thing that has been interesting as I've read more about some of the criticisms of the food system over the last few weeks has been about consolidation of industries, and it's been less. The commentary has been less about consolidation of farm size and increased farm sizes. It's been more, I would say, explicitly about the meat industry. But do you see that as a trend that continues out of COVID in terms of any of those pressures on smaller farmers that need to lower costs and need to increase scale? Do you think that trend accelerates, stays on course?
I'm torn on that, because I think you're going to see the people that choose to compete as traditional corn, bean, wheat, cotton, traditional crop, they're going to have to get larger and continue to get larger. But some of these people who are caught in the middle are going to pivot, and they're going to try and get smaller, and they're going to get smaller and work more, like I said, those specialty type crops. So I think we could see more small farms come around as we move forward. So I'm a little bit torn on that. I just don't think it's just going to be big giant farms everywhere. I think it's your big giant farms are going to be the ones that are your traditional corn, bean, and wheat players that are trying to compete as low cost producers globally, and they have a chance. And like I said, I think there's an opportunity for those folks as well as the ones that want to maybe get a little bit smaller and more competitive on the specialty crop side.
Got it. Thanks, Kevin. Gary, do you have any response to any of that? As someone who's sort of more involved in the specialty side, is deeply networked in that area, any distinct trends that you're seeing that's either that these times have been harder on farmers in specialty, advantageous in some way, or causing major shifts in some way? What are your major takeaways from a pretty much a fundamentally different type of crop and economics around it?
Yeah, so some of the specialty crops that we've seen the most impact on we don't play in the arena anymore. In Florida, tomatoes, I know it's been hit very hard. I know some of the leaf crops that are dependent on food service, like you alluded to earlier. In strawberries, my company, Wish Farms, we're heavily geared towards retail. So my initial thought was this isn't going to affect us that badly. But we saw some very wild swings in demand in mid-March when the shutdown was first beginning. We saw for about a week, unusually high demand where we couldn't get enough fruit to our retailers, and they were all scrambling to get deliveries faster. And then that was followed by a drop off of the cliff the following week, like the third week of March, where we just lost every order on our books. And berries, especially strawberries, is a crop that you really can't sit on and hold it on in storage. I mean, that's something you pick and ship the same day or the next day. So we were literally just void of orders for a few days, and a lot of our growers had to quit harvesting. Fortunately, we were at the end of the season in Florida. But the demand for fresh berries has not fully recovered yet. It's been a very slow recovery, and I've thought a lot about it, and there's a few reasons for that, I believe. One is fresh berries is more of an impulse buy for a lot of people, whereas some people have it on their shopping list every week, and they'll buy them no matter what. But we're very dependent. The industry is very dependent on promotions and retailers, promoting and building big displays. So the absence of people not making those impulse purchases has certainly hurt demand. And I was talking to a friend this morning, and he said, we haven't been buying berries because the Instacart shopper we use, they're not very selective. They're not as selective as we are. So yeah, all of these things have really impacted us. And then on the labor front, I mean, that's been a real scary thing for us, especially with our California crop just kicking off pretty good right now. We've got a labor force that, part of it's H-2A, which is the guest worker program that we're very dependent on. And some of these people are, being housed in groups, and you could get an outbreak and lose labor. Early on, we were scared we weren't even going to be able to get the visas because of the Mexican government and our government not processing them. So that was something I think that really highlighted the dependence that U.S. agriculture have, especially on the specialty crops for labor. Our strawberry industry, we require about one person for every acre of strawberries. When you're talking about some of the grain crops, it might be one person for, I don't know how many hundreds of acres one person can harvest, but it's a much different scenario. So it really highlighted how dependent the U.S. is on foreign labor because of that uncertainty we had back in March. But fortunately, that is not the big issue right now. My big issue is just keeping our workers safe and productive.
Yep, absolutely. Those are great points, Gary and Kevin. Are there any other comments or observations from anybody on the call here? Any trends that they've seen? Anything they think is worth noting that maybe hasn't been discussed yet before we jump into supply chain?
So, Gary, this is Craig Heron. How are you this morning? I think your comment about Instacart is really interesting. So, as in, online and delivery groceries are up huge through this, and it, probably to a point where there will be a significant percentage that stays that way. How does the industry solve for the quality control at the delivery point or the picking point inside of that kind of retail to make sure that you don't have a hit in demand because of people not perceiving your quality's down?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't really have any control at the retail level. We just do our best to provide the best product to our retailers. And Walmart actually has an interesting concept. I was talking to one of their senior people a year or two ago, and they said that when they pick their groceries for consumers, a lot of stores, they'll try to rotate out the older product first, but they said they take the opposite approach, that they're using the freshest product for the online orders. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but yeah, I personally don't have a good solution for it because we have no control over that. Did that answer what you're
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone's commentary there. So I want to sort of jump here to segment 2 on the right computer. And also cover some sort of state of the world before COVID, during COVID kind of thing here. So thinking about it from sort of a globalization standpoint, this has been something that's been talked about and heavily exposed over the last couple of months. Is essentially 80% of the planet's mouths are fed in part by imports, and that's 3 times as much as the year 2000, which really just speaks to the degree of globalization that's occurred over the last 20 years. And to a certain extent, that's obviously affected certain countries more than others. I think it speaks a little bit to the vulnerability aspect that we spoke about on the last slide. Another major trend was around consolidation. It's something that's been spoken a lot as well, is around, particularly in food processing and production. Essentially that, for example, half of America's poultry market is controlled by just 4 companies. And then additionally, something that was more the norm, as opposed to something that's obviously changed now, and we expect to go back to somewhere closer to the mean, would be around restaurants and food service. Essentially, food service accounted for 30% of all calories consumed prior to COVID, which obviously is not the case currently. So now some major changes that we've seen over the last couple of months include, e-grocery, it's been interesting learning about this from the perspective of investors who were around when sort of e-grocery was sort of first, brought up as an opportunity. And it's an idea that's been around for a long time. It's been hard to execute. It's been hard to get the economics right. It's still hard to get the economics right. But that now we're seeing this real push into users who might not have otherwise signed up for a product like this, and for services like this. So for example, we've seen Instacart's delivery force expand from 180,000 to 500,000 people in 8 weeks, and they expect to expand to 750,000 people by the summer. And in the same token, those types of services have seen major growing pains, where initially, based on those initial loads, they were seeing requests that would take 30 minutes, and that was sort of the promise that they were making, sort of rapid delivery times and high efficiency. Can take half a day or longer now. And so adapting to that massive growth has definitely caused some infrastructure pains for companies like that. We also see that some of the major bulk products have been impacted. So, we think about butter and cheese, and the bulk of that, obviously all of us, not all of us, but many of us may have butter and cheese in our house, but most of us don't buy it in the industrial quantities that you might see in food service. And so major waste at that level, and the ability to repurpose and replace and resell that type of product has proven that the supply chain is not in a position to be able to adapt quickly to that problem, which has led to substantial waste for those types of products. And that sort of goes into this redirecting demand issue that we have here. And then I would say finally, there's been an increased interest in sort of modular farming solutions, indoor farming, local food production, resiliency. And I think that's a trend that we'll continue to see grow, but it's interesting in the context of this big globalization movement that we look at this increase in the way in which where we get food from over the last 20 years has moved in that direction. I'm not, I struggle to say with confidence whether that will move the needle one way or the other. I'd be curious to know if there are any perspectives on that in terms of sort of local production and the ability to produce at a smaller scale, but also have a close to the level of efficiency. Russ, this is something that you and I talked a little bit over email. I'm curious to know if you have any perspectives here on sort of this balance in the supply chain between efficiency and resiliency, particularly as somebody who's an entrepreneur, a farmer, has a perspective from both sides. Are there any main takeaways that you have over the last few weeks and things that you might see changing?
I think it's too early to tell where the lasting trends are. What I can say is certainly that people that were local producers that serve local consumers, they've all been struggling to keep up with demand. I don't think that means that we come out of this thing with everybody buying food at farmers markets from farmers they know anymore. I think we'll need new business models to create the scale, but it is interesting to see, in my world of especially the regional, local, direct-to-consumer meat producers, business is up 300 to 500% kind of overall, and people are slammed. And importantly, perhaps in this thing, the processing facilities that are associated with that supply chain, they're nowhere near up to the volume, but they've been more resilient as well, right? So there's been way fewer instances of processing facilities have to shut down. We've got a load of cattle going in today, and to a facility that's been able to produce, even 20% above their normal throughput. And they've continued to have no cases, and they're doing well. So I think this resiliency versus efficiency thing is not really an either or debate. But I think what we're probably going to come out of here on the other side is exploration and settling on a new optimum that kind of weighs the trade-off. So the cost of concentrated meat processing and concentrated channel deliveries, even this restaurant and retail thing that you talked about, will cause people to diversify supply chains, diversify intermediate steps, and then figure out how to find some hybrid optimization. I think that's going to invite, from an entrepreneur's perspective, at Blue Nest Beef, we're direct to consumer meat company. This has been certainly a tailwind for us, but I think there'd be many other ways where I think scale still matters. Maybe that's the important thing to say. And so there'll be other entrepreneurs that figure out other ways to scale. I mean, we achieve scale by working with a large NGO to get scale on both the market and the supply side. But I think there'll be innovative entrepreneurs that figure out how to use technology, market insight, optimization, things that come through this thing. And they're all going to tilt the balance towards some kind of regionalization of supply. It's going to create investment market opportunities and kind of middle tier stuff. I think the small mom and pop farmers that, create lifestyle businesses will do well. But I think the thing that will re-engineer the overall system will be people that figure out these kind of intermediate scale business models that can serve regional markets with some efficiency, perhaps with, the comment before about specialty products as well, right? There's a bit of decommoditization going on. I mean, we certainly see people going, oh, wow, that's what good food tastes like, right? So it's bringing back consumer awareness. How it all plays out, it's a bit ambiguous at this point.
Got it. Any other thoughts on sort of some of the supply chain shifts that we're seeing here? Any of the waste that's occurring in the supply chain currently? Any innovations that anybody's aware of that might be in a good position to get some adoption in the coming months as in a response here?
I have a comment just on the food service, and the redirecting
Yeah.
demand. And so that's been really fascinating to watch the difference. And I think so many people didn't realize what a big difference there was between food that goes to food service and food that goes direct to retail. So I think there's a big difference in what we eat, where we get it, and how we get it. And the amount of food service, 35% of lettuce and tomatoes that's grown goes to food service, and 15% of fruit goes to food service. So right now, with restaurants down 80% and fast food down 30%, a lot of that food has nowhere to go. And so a lot of people say, well, okay, just make it go to retail. But you can't do that because the mix is very different. Packing is very different. You can't take a huge package of chopped up lettuce that was going to go to a deli and, put it in Safeway. So there's a difference in the ability to pack the actual packages, the branding on the packages, and then the temperature control through the cold chain is different for those different products. There's also a difference in what we eat. Onions is a great example that we don't eat as many onions at home as we do in restaurants. The same with asparagus. So there really, it's this rebalancing that's happening, and growers and shippers, it's a real struggle for them to figure out, like, what do I plant and what's going to be open and what am I going to be able to sell? So I think what I'm hoping comes out of this is the ability for the people who are using the product and the people who are growing the product to be able to do some better demand forecasting and really understand, like, what is it we need to be growing and where does it need to go and how do we forecast that and communicate that a little bit better.
That's a really interesting point. I was thinking about it from the supply demand forecasting perspective and some of the companies that are coming up in that space. And I wonder, I mean, is it so much at this point about supply demand forecasting as opposed to flexibility of infrastructure? Because I think about, there's a company I was hoping to have on the call today. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it. But Kevin Davis, who's the CEO of a company called Rebound Technologies that does some really exciting work in flash freezing and really high efficient flash freezing. And I wonder, from a really simple perspective, you would think that if there was anything you could do with a bunch of waste in the food system, you could at least freeze it and find a use case for it at some later point. Is that not the case? And what are the challenges behind trying to do something like that? Is it just the sheer volume?
I think a lot is the sheer volume. Go ahead.
No, I'm going to jump in next. You go first.
No, go ahead.
I mean, it's sheer volume, but like David, we had this problem with blueberries, right? Because, and this is why, in my opinion, the food waste in field thing honestly is overblown, I think, as an issue. But I mean, you're not going to harvest blueberries for freezer prices because the price is just lower than the cost of actually harvesting them. At a very simple, that is the issue. And so and consumers don't like right now we're still hoarding frozen fruit, but like how can you either have to change the way that people think about that, or you have to attach something else to it, which I think is where the interesting opportunity is. And kind of where I wanted to go with that too is, and where I see like your first question here, which is where is there kind of an opportunity to consider, I guess. I and Ag Launch, I'm working on this kind of open market consortium play right now that is like suddenly getting more, a little bit more speed than it's ever had. So what we're trying to do is trace attributes from whatever the attribute is. Maybe it's a nutritional attribute, maybe it's a regionality, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? But smart contracts, right? So I think you can look at projecting what the value of something is going to be, but at the end of the day, and this is how kind of FBN started up too, in theory. But there has to be some connection between the purchaser and the producer. And like you guys were all saying before, like, we're not going to go into a place where everyone's suddenly buying from farmers markets 100% of the time, and that's just crazy inefficient. It can't all be D2C. And so what I'm looking at is kind of and where I see there being an opportunity is, how do you connect what right now is this small producer who is trying to go D2C? How do you connect that to actually institutional purchasers later on, so that you can have like that's, and how do you use that opportunity to link in these value added attributes? And maybe you could link that into flash freezing and say you're locking in more nutrition because you are,
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Connie. Bonnie, did you have anything to add there?
Nope, I think that was a great point.
Yeah, this is Kim. I wanted to jump in along the same lines. You talked about prediction and supply chain. Sometimes it's the physical world that gets in the way. So we have more eggs than we know what to do with. But we have a real shortage in the United States right now of dozen egg containers, dozen size. And, restaurants and food service buy eggs 30 dozen at a time. But humans buy it a dozen at a time, 1 dozen at a time. And so something as simple as that. And it uncovered some interesting food safety rules that are on the books. So for example, in most states, for food safety reasons, you can't sell loose eggs in a food store to a consumer. They have to be in a package. And so, even if you said, okay, I'm just going to send the boxes of 30 dozen to the food store and let people take 6 and put them in a bag, that's illegal in several states. So these kinds of things kind of get in the way. My local mass food retailer, national chain retailer, actually has a sign up right now for butchers. It turns out that we are, it's not hard to imagine, but when food stores kind of outsourced the packaging of food, we created a shortage and a retirement push for individuals who knew how to take a side or a primal cut and cut it into meal-sized portions or familiar cuts. And it's unclear, and as I was talking to a few people then in retail after this experience, it's unclear how you retrain butchers. People don't know how to disassemble an animal anymore. There are a few hunters that can, but it's just, it's kind of an interesting place we're in where, even the plants that are down, they can probably process many more sides. But then once you have a side of beef, you have to do something with it. You can only hang it for so long. And so kind of thinking through that aspect of it, I think is going to be an interesting challenge going forward for resiliency purposes.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. It also just make, it's hard because I start to think about, I also don't see there being tons more butchers being trained necessarily in the future going forward in terms of a long-term impact. So how we account for that when further disruptions occur, or if further disruptions occur, sort of remains to be seen. Because it's something that's proving to be a challenge now.
I'm not sure I agree.
Go ahead.
And the reason I'm not sure I agree is I don't know how far everybody's contingency planning is going to change into the future. So to the extent that bioterrorism wasn't on a lot of people's radar screen, it used to be in the 70s and then it dropped off. And now that we've had a natural virus come through, it's back on our radar screens. So, you know, just like if I think about Florida producers who weren't thinking about hurricanes until their pack houses got wiped out, and now they have a resiliency plan around hurricanes. Then, you know, I feel like this is going to be part of the resiliency plan. And the question is, you know, do you bring a certain proportion of your butchering back into the store, maybe at a high end in certain places, so that if there's a problem, you at least have one guy that knows how to disassemble sides, or two. I feel like it might actually shift a little backward from a resiliency perspective.
Interesting.
That's what I meant by the balance. And I think butchery is just an example of it. But I think that you get into we already had a trend, maybe people weren't aware of this. The craft butchery is in localities across the country. It was already a trend before this started. And they've certainly been slammed as well. So there is more, or there are more butchers today than I'd say 3-5 years ago, something like that. But, you know, can you educate and train, and will you see the reappearance of butchery in retail grocery stores? I don't know, but it probably, I think you'll see innovative business models of, you know, maybe like craft beer, of, you know, things that may pop up here to kind of scale the skills and channels associated with high-end meats, like Kim said.
Yeah. This is Mike Wise from SG. I think I agree with those points completely, and I think some of it just ties to the consumer education piece. I mean, I know craft beer is struggling right now, of course, but the kind of how much education can you do virtually, not necessarily for the train, but also to kind of drive forward those concepts, and I think that I think also just the, you know, this was alluded to, but like the trust element of right now, I feel like, you know, people are falling back on trusted sources of things. What's known is what's good, and it'll be interesting to see when there is a shift back to food service. It's not just going to be about you know, who is servicing people before, but I think there'll be a lot of new concepts popping up with some of these values that people are talking about today, and it'll be interesting to see how folks sell in, either ones that did well in this period, sell into food service and enter the space, or you know, how folks will readjust back from the transitions that they did make over the coming months.
Well, great points all around. Thanks, Mike, Russ, Kim, for your inputs there. And I will need to read up on the craft butcher industry to educate myself. So I appreciate the insight there. Any other thoughts here before we jump sort of more over to consumer side impacts?
Just
David,
one other thought.
This is
Oh,
me
you can go ahead.
Pork and Good. So Pork and Good is a cell-based meat company, but as you know, my first company in Singapore is an urban farming company. So just to your points around flexibility and resilience, that all of our farms have seen an average of sort of 30% increase in sales in Singapore during COVID. And because we have shorter, basically crop cycles, we're able to adapt to where we're seeing problems with imports. So we've like shifted some farms from herbs entirely into like Chinese bok choy. And so it's like opening up new avenues of the kind of value that the urban farming model is providing. And so it's like one way that you can increase that flexibility in the supply chain. And of course, it's all there in the city. So none of the sort of transport disruptions are affecting us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really. We might as well just discuss it now while we're on the topic. And I think that I feel like this is this constant battle I hear between the ability of those types of systems to feed people from a caloric content standpoint, as opposed to replacing fresh produce. But I think it's important now when we think about from a fresh produce perspective and be able to get to have a more flexible system. But in a place like Singapore, have you seen sort of an increase in the ability for, you know, families to feed themselves on the types of products that are produced from urban farming and vertical farming? Because obviously Singapore is a pioneer in the space, and has built some really resilient food systems. So curious to know what you've thought in terms of the functional development of that field.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is unique in that the average per capita, you know, GDP is very high. So in terms of vulnerable population, percentages are lower. And where we at least are pricing is not cheaper than a Chinese vegetable coming in from China or Malaysia, but it is cheaper than what you would get from, say, Europe. So it's actually a mid-range price product. And considering just in terms of share of wallet, what people spend on food, it's not a whole lot more. So it might be 20% more than Malaysian bok choy, but it's still like a couple dollars, right? Of like what you would
compare on a taste basis. You know, will people pay more for fresh and the better taste of local produce?
So restaurants will. And some people will, but like most people are buying on price. And I think maybe it was Mike's point earlier, trust. So just as people's awareness on health is going up, like it's less freshness and taste. I mean, those things are always important, of course, but this idea that it could be pesticide free, it's clean. You know, people were having really random reactions to all kinds of produce coming in from China in the early days of this. And so the sort of traceability and trust aspect was much more important.
Great. Thanks, Nia. Alex, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just building on that, I think something that we've been seeing is countries thinking about food security and local production with a longer term view, sort of thinking about the challenges that they're anticipating in 2030, 2040 and out, and beginning, I think being motivated by COVID-19 in some ways to develop the infrastructure that it's going to take years to do it, but investing in the technology and infrastructure that can ultimately help them, become more Singapore-like, right? I think that that's something that we've been seeing more and more of over the past few months.
Got it. And are you seeing that, in across food in general, or you think about this more from sort of an alternative proteins perspective, either by cellular agriculture or synthetic biology, or is it sort of across the board from sort of this perspective?
Across the board, I think that they're looking at every vector that can deliver food security, and protein production through fermentation's one slice of that, but they're taking a pretty aggressive view of how these technologies can over time influence the security of their countries.
Yeah.
And just to build on Alex's point, so we're looking at this very much from impact on the food ecosystem. But there's another aspect that's unique to animal agriculture in that it's a risk factor in potentially contributing to zoonotic transmission, right? Mm-hmm. So there's another aspect of the regulatory environment. So there's been a recent bill introduced by Senator Warren and Booker, which I'm sure most people on this call have heard about, to end factory farming by 2040. And I wouldn't have imagined such a bill ever being introduced in the US a year ago. And so there's pressure to really reconsider concentrated animal feeding operations as we consider pandemic risks.
Did anybody else lose Nia's audio?
Wait, I was just done. That was it. I muted myself.
Oh, you are. Oh, got it.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore, I completely agree. The appreciation of industrial animal agriculture in the zoonotic transmission process is going to gain a lot of attention. But it's not animal agriculture per se. I think, our category of regenerative animal agriculture really is going to get more attention as well. And how that plays out in these kind of re-regionalized food systems is a bit harder to describe, but absolutely the idea of concentrating animals in highly efficient industrialized things not only has supply chain risk, but it has actual contributing risk towards the diseases themselves. And there's gonna be a great awakening on that.
Yeah, and I wish we had more time in the conversation today, because that's one of the main areas I'd like to dive into, because there's a lot of really interesting compounding public health factors that go into animal agriculture, factory farming, antibiotic overusage, the consequences of health regulatory that plays into that, or any legislation that gets drawn up. And yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up that piece about the legislation, because I wasn't aware of that bill. So I'll be interested to read more about that in the next few days. But yeah, I can only imagine that the awareness increasing around that, and the pressure increasing around that as well.
Yeah, and there's actually some new technology that's being developed that actually facilitates, I'll say, more grass-fed distance, utilizing of smaller parcels. It's being piloted mostly in New Zealand, but there's basically a way that you can contain livestock without actually having to put up a fence. And that has huge benefits as far as, being able to utilize parcels that you don't have to invest in the infrastructure for.
Are you talking about like digital fencing, or is that a different technology?
Yeah. Well, it's a slightly so it's kind of like an industrial version of the invisible dog fence, except that there isn't a, you basically geofence an area for a set of animals who are wearing tags around their neck, and then as they get close to the line of the day, it buzzes.
Yep.
And unlike the invisible dog fence, if you cross over the line, it buzzes, and then it starts to do other things that make it more painful and drives them back across the line. So you can't charge the line and get over it and then be in the neighbor's yard.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've definitely, at least one company called Vents, that with a V, that's doing that. And I think there's another in Australia, New Zealand, that I think Halter might be the name of the company.
Yeah. There's several of them underway. Some are specializing more in small ruminants, some in large ruminants, some in dairy, some in beef. All I'm saying is that there is technology evolving that is more your digital technology that I think will enable some very different behaviors, because it materially changes the economics when you don't have to put up fence lines.
Yep.
Agreed.
Okay, well, I know if you have a hard stop at the top of the hour, jump off as you will. I hope you can stay on. I think we'll at least cover this last slide here, and the others will be available as in a download. I think we may not have time to go into all these as discussion points, but we may cover some of this here. But I think the consumer changes have been some of the most robust and interesting and reported on. So I'll walk through kind of a similar form we did before, and then open up for some thoughts as well. Some trends that were taking place before COVID. Small brands in market share. We saw a substantial increase in more specialized, more personalized, animal-free, sustainable, better for you types of brands that were taking a lot of space, and you can see that sort of in this chart in the top right quadrant, and sort of the rise of these smaller brands. Convenience was a growing trend. E-grocery was something that was growing, but not with the same robustness, certainly, that it has in the last 8 weeks. And then obviously animal-free, plant-based has been a trend that's been growing over time, and that I think we've seen obviously accelerate during COVID-19. And I'll invite you to take a look at the plant-based meat surge. I'm sure many of you have been aware of this growth, but at 264% growth during the last 2 months in purchasing of plant-based meats is pretty substantial. And some of that has to do with meat supply, or the ability to get or meat pricing. And some of it has to do with just the acceleration of this trend and the awareness around some of the challenges of factory farming, of animal agriculture. So we've seen a substantial growth in that category. One thing that we were debating as a team the other day I thought was really interesting was around whether or not consumers were moving more towards wellness and immunity from their food or getting convenience and comfort from their food. And I'd be interested to hear anybody else's thoughts if they feel like they have a strong conclusion, but I can only surmise that it's a little bit of both. We've seen a little bit of a comeback from some of these brands that we thought were dying or really hurting. Nestle and Kraft Heinz both drove up sales in the last quarter substantially around some food products. I read an article that was called the Return of the Hot Pocket that really talks about some of these comfort foods that maybe had been forgotten previously. At the same time that people are really interested in finding ways that their food can bring them increased immunity. And I think that I think that the immunity trend will continue to grow. I think the food as health trend is strong and something it's growing awareness. But I think they're also, it's hard to say whether or not that, there could be also an increased interest in frozen foods, in greater convenience around that. And Kim brought this up in a call we had last week that, consumers sort of rediscovering this part of the store that maybe they'd kind of forgotten about, which was really interesting. And I guess the final thing that I would point you to is just this really dramatic increase in e-commerce usage. This is a slide that was floating around on Twitter yesterday that I feel like I really needed to throw on here. And I think there was somebody quoted, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And I thought this was a really interesting just jump in terms of the amount of e-commerce. And obviously I think some of that will revert back to the mean, but in the same token, I think once you get people on board for trends like that, it's really impactful. So, I guess to start sort of discussions off, I'd be interested to get, Mike, your perspective. I feel like S2G has a lot of expertise, spends a lot of time thinking about consumer changes and how that impacts the food system. Are there any trends that you either are paying more attention to now because of COVID that you feel like have either been accelerated, or any new trends that you feel like are really standing out to you and your team that you'll be paying attention to over the next, 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think the food as immunity concept is accelerating as well. We talked about indoor ag and other kind of food security, decentralization type trends. I think food as immunity, food as medicine are some things that are likely to get more interest from consumers over time. I think that, along with, as you noted, kind of the plant-based stuff as well, was already growing, and consumers will start thinking, possibly will start thinking more about their health outcomes associated with what they eat, and so I think that's one. I do think online there's a lot of cart sizes are going up, have gone up significantly for online ordering. And so it'll be interesting to see where that levels out, and what happens with BOPIS or buy online, pick up in store. I mean, I think there's probably going to be more of those models as people move outside. So it's, I think it was maybe Russ or someone else talked about what does this hybrid look like in the future. But certainly, I don't think that some of the old models and ways are going to be completely evaporated. And I think that when this is the time to be thinking about food service models and also starting to reinvest in the space as well. So I think there are a lot of interesting trends, but I do think that not to over-index as well.
Got it. Thanks, Mike. Nia and Alex, in no particular order, I'd just be curious to hear more on your thoughts as this plant-based trend picks up and inevitably more investment and more interest in synthetic biology to produce unique proteins, as well as cultivated meats as a way of producing full animal proteins and structures. Where as the interest increase increases, where do you see there really being opportunities now for there to be increased scale in some of these solutions and products? And where do you see it's that even though there may be increased interest, the timing still may not be right? I think about some of the on more, thinking about, Geltor and collagen products that are currently available in market, as opposed to cultivated meat where we have yet to see a product available. I'd be interested to sort of hear your guys' thoughts between interest and market readiness.
Yeah, I can start. I will have to jump soon. Sorry, you caught me right.
No problem.
Yeah, so I've definitely seen interest jump significantly. The different governments, different suppliers, meat packers reaching out to see how soon we can get to market. Unfortunately, I think even the most ambitious plans put cultivated meat at still 1 or 2 years out. And then that 1 or 2 year launch is at a relatively small scale and a drop in the bucket of the general meat market. So I think in terms of actual supply and sort of market share, the impact will be low. But I think one way we're benefiting, I kind of alluded it to earlier, is the speed which regulations will change to really accommodate innovation in our sector is changing. So the speed and level of engagement with the USDA and FDA has picked up as people see the real value for the contribution of the sector just in terms of resiliency. So you now have essentially more distributed meat plants near your demand centers. They're not supplying all of your meat demand, but they are helping with the volatility in the supply chain. You don't have the issues in transport. You don't have the issues of labor. You also are essentially producing in aseptic conditions. And then you don't have the problems, the contributing factors that we spoke about with concentrated animals. We don't have animals, right? So definitely renewed interest, but every company in the sector is still in the R&D stage.
Got it. Do you feel like there are significant initiatives from the U.S., like from actual, government support on this type of work in our country, or is it really mostly sort of in some of those earlier pioneers, Singapore, Japan, et cetera?
So I would say that in terms of research dollars, China, Japan, Singapore, and even India and Israel are leading in terms of governments putting research dollars, and Europe, I should say. The EU also has some funds. But at the same time, some of the most well-funded, and they're all privately funded, and most innovative companies are here. And so where the US is helping and moving is more in getting a regulatory pathway for the safe introduction of these products to market. And I think that regulatory pathway might be the fastest in China, but the US is not too far behind, and then be followed by Europe.
Great, thanks, Nia. Alex, do you have any thoughts on the similar vein? I mean, sort of being in a different position from market ready, have any initiatives, if any, changed on Geltor's side over the last 2 months in terms of bullishness on the markets you're going after, areas in which you see perhaps new opportunities for expansion that you might not have considered before?
Yeah, for sure. So, I totally agree with what was just mentioned before. I think we see with the businesses that have the technology ready to go in sectors where there's a regulatory framework that they can flow through, the customers are there. I think that that's something that we're seeing with these businesses that have launched, primarily in the plant-based space, Impossible Beyond, et cetera. So I think that the challenge is, for the businesses that are still building their technology to keep doing that, and to continue understanding how that's going to interact with the regulatory frameworks. The other sort of like points that came up just when I was listening to the answer were, one, if we just want to get a sense of so at a high level, right? Like when we're trying to understand what demand is looking like in this like COVID situation, we saw a significant increase in demand. If we just look at like revenue for the first quarter of this year at Geltor, it was like bigger than all of last year combined. And that was, I think, just like a real data point around what's happening in the world with a need for these types of protein sources. And it reminded me of something, you know, that we've been talking about across the different areas of this call, just the importance of channels when you're navigating these sort of opportunities in real time. Like if you're partnering with brands, or if you are a brand that is in retail as opposed to some of the other sectors that are being more heavily hit, you're going to see a really different growth trajectory. And that's true of the emerging technologies as well. So the things that matter for, you know, the traditional brands are just as important for these emerging technologies as well. Like you really have to understand the channels that you're moving through. And then I think that the other kind of like bigger picture thing that I think has been really interesting to follow, and I think this is a bit of a longer term view, but you know, when you look at the penetration of these products, you know, if you look at, you know, brewed collagen versus, you know, collagen that comes from animals, right now the penetration is relatively small for fermented products. But I think just like, you know, if you look back at other bio-based products and kind of look at that similar graph where you have like penetration on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, there are these inflection points. And I think that for certain products in the market, again, where the technology, regulatory framework, and opportunity are aligned, you're going to start to see those like flip up to the other side of the curve, where they can become actually the leading kind of like form of supply for some of these products, not for all of them. So I think that's what we're seeing across the board. It's like channels matter more. Sorry, that's my cat yelling at me. channels really matter for like whether you're like the deepest of deep technology companies, or if you're somebody that's been working with a product that has existed for like thousands of years, right? That's going to be true forever, and that's super exciting.
Yeah, I think I think the inflection point piece is really important, partially because I think I hadn't quite realized, you know, I think about particularly, you know, plant-based, which is a little bit more widespread at this point, you know, plant-based meats, et cetera, that, you know, it kind of felt like they already had their moment, or they were having their moment currently. But then, you know, this expansion into Kroger for Impossible and, you know, some of these other movements that are happening, it shows that there's still a lot more ground to be covered. And so I think that's a really important point. And that for some of these things, we're not really there yet on sort of the flip the switch moment that we might be considering. We are about 15 minutes over our time here. So I do have some other slides. I'm not going to go through them. I'll give you a sense of what they are. And if you'd like a copy of the deck, we will make a copy of the deck available to anybody who would like one. Just to give you a sense of what that we were going to cover. It was going to be a discussion around animal agriculture, robotics, automation, labor shifts, local food production, and supply chain resilience. We did cover a lot of that in this conversation today. I think that was I really appreciate everybody's thoughtful inputs on this. But if you'd like to view any of those slides, they'll be available in the PDF. So with that, I'd like to just sort of wrap things up. You know, there's been a lot of really interesting, thoughtful perspectives brought to light here. I think a lot for us to chew on going forward. And some of the trends I think I've captured here, but certainly not all of them, you know, in terms of some key long-term considerations, thinking about labor pressures, the consumer buying behavior has changed, some trade-offs, you know, thinking about these trade-offs between efficiency and resiliency are really important going forward. Obviously some key accelerations that we've monitored here, particularly on the consumer side, but also some remaining questions, you know, about thinking about the globalization of the food supply chain and whether we revert back to the norm or create more locally produced, more modular, more flexible supply chain production systems, and how that comes online remains to be seen. I think, you know, one thing we didn't get into was about automation and robotics. I think there is an interesting question about if the labor problem persists and is exacerbated, how technology gets adopted and whether or not it's necessarily market ready is another question. And so we've already seen a lot of early adopter activity on the robotics side in certain crops, and whether that continues, I think it's true it will, and there's going to be a lot of it's going to be interesting as those types of technologies actually get into the field. And I think, monitoring ways in which consumers buy food changes, and stays consistent with some of the growth that we've seen over the last, 8 weeks is really important. So those are some of the thoughts that I want to leave us here with, but I think we've covered a lot of really interesting points thus far. For anybody who's listening to this on recording, anybody who's new to these calls today, for your own edification, we host these webinars every week, Wednesdays, every 2 weeks, Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Central Time. And we typically will do sort of the first webinar on healthcare and the second on food and agriculture. So if you'd like to tune in to future webinars, please feel free to let me know. We'd love to have you on board. With that, I'd like to pause and see if there's any final closing comments, questions from anybody on the call today, anything that they'd like to leave us with before we go ahead and drop off.
Hey, David, thanks. This is Gary Wisnowski. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it very much. I mean, these are very unprecedented, interesting times. I mean, there's a lot of trends we're seeing that, I thought we were going to be able to compare things to 2008, and there's things that are just really baffling to me. Organic demand is one of them, but yeah, it's just we're still learning as we go here. We've never experienced anything like this, and the outcomes are going to be very interesting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone who was able to participate today, from our speakers to our experts to our guests. We really appreciate everybody's input. And please let me know if you'd like a copy of the deck following the call. But otherwise, have a great rest of your Wednesday, and thank you again for your participation.
Thanks, David. Good job.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Well done.